and for those of you who've been in Windsor for a while, this will be a trip down memory lane. For those of you who are newer to David's life, it'll be a history lesson. These are Bobby's words. David Baird was born and lived in Windsor all his life. He did go to a special school in Truro. Needless to say, he didn't stay long and was soon back in Windsor. I would describe David as a self-taught, very determined, quite stubborn man with a heart of gold. David loved the town of Windsor, and the people of Windsor were his friends. He was a great listener. David was educated by the tradespeople of Windsor, whether it was the electrical, which was his favorite, mechanical, plumbing, visits to the town shed or the Windsor Fire Department were his training ground. He took it all in, and if he needed more information, David would visit Homer Rose's barbershop on Water Street or Ab Fogarty's shop on Main Street. In later years, David went to Al Curry's, Merle's barbershop on Gray Street, and it was close to David's old home on Monroe Street. Windsor had its share of characters. There's an understatement. David was one of them. I rank him right up there with, now here's some names, Norman Nelson, Hazel Bruce, Doc Rogers, Gordon Burrell, Blab Brothers. Do I hear an amen? The three main things in David's life in this order were radios of all kinds, food, his appetite, and David liked cats. He always had a couple. In David's early years, he spent his time down at Denny McDonald's field with the Clark boys, or the McIsaac brothers and the gang from Ferry Hill. Lots of good times and always David's radios. We would all play hockey on the quarry pond. David wasn't much for hockey, so he'd wander over to the town shed across the street and check out the action. He had his daily rounds. He'd stop at our place, Boyd's Transfer on Albert Street. If nothing exciting was going on, he would carry on to McNeil and Brothers Garage. I think that at that time there were 7 garages in Windsor, and David would visit them all. Some days were busier than others, but David always made Bill Lance's his last stop. In between stops, there could be a water break in winter, or a fire somewhere in town, and naturally David was there. He liked the action. David also spent a lot of time with Moe Smith and Moe's father Lou at Smith's Sporting Goods store, or at Elm Crop Playground with Moe's baseball teams, and again, we always had radios. David also, in summer months, would help John Monroe work on his boat down behind Moe's store. He also fished the Avon River with the Bowman brothers, Bill and the late Irving, who had a fishing boat at the Windsor Wharf. David also fished with his friend Harry Spenger on the river. Like I said before, David was real handy with electronics. If a machine was broken, he could fix it. David learned a lot from the late Tom McManus. He would spend hours working on different projects, or you could find him at Bill Armstrong, Avon Restaurant, fixing the dishwasher, or over at the Black Bear Tavern, working on the refrigeration unit. So we think. There's no way to put it, Bobby. He was fixing that for his good friend Carrie Ross. David, I think, enjoyed nighttime. He would spend hours at the late Len Dunfield's restaurant on Water Street. Len had a ham radio set, and they used to talk to people from away. David was amazed by that. He would spend all his night over at the Railroad Gatehouse at the foot of Main Street with his friend, the late Huey Lytle, who was in charge of the gates. And I can just imagine, Bobby says, the stories that were told there. At that time in all our lives, Windsor was growing. The causeway was built. There was lots of work. Everyone was busy. Carrie Ross had purchased the Jim Allison property, which later became the Midnight Stables. David was in his glory between checking out the Black Bear Tavern. That keeps coming up. He was in his glory between checking out the Black Bear Tavern or spending time out at the farm, and of course putting a sound system through the whole barn. I also mentioned David liked food. So between Audrey Ross, there you are, You're in everything. And Ralph and Donna Spence, they kept him fed. We'd also take David to Walker's or Gordon's Grill for lunches. These last few years, he's enjoyed the meals at the Baptist Church or with his new friends and family at the Harvest House. Oh, I just thought of one thing, Bobby says. I think I missed it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how David got the name Captain Baird, but it stuck. We've called him that for years. This is the last page of David's story, it says, and it goes on for 4 more. You were reading this. Things, I'm doing okay? Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. Things began to change for David and around Windsor, especially for David. His mother passed away, businesses closed up. David was on his own now. I myself, like lots of others, moved away to Ontario or Alberta. I used to call from Alberta and ask my father how David was doing. Dad would always say, he's still around. I saw him uptown. But winters were tough for David. His health started to fail. He moved from the old house on Monroe Street to different apartments. In Windsor, David was determined, and when Wayne Newcomb bought the old Boyd's transfer property and bottle exchange from my Uncle Fred, David was back in business. A familiar spot with junk and lots of electronics. They tell me David would even make the odd trip to Halifax or Dartmouth with Wayne, and things have been pretty quiet in Windsor now. David wouldn't leave town. He was scared he'd miss something. Tim Hortons opened in town. It was a new place for David to go and get the news and visit with old friends and meet new ones. When Bobby moved home from Ontario 6 years ago, the first time David saw him at Tim Hortons, he asked, "Can you get me a new scanner radio?" I always stayed in touch with Dave. When I was home on vacation, he'd keep me up to date on the happenings around town. It wasn't long after I moved home, Wayne Newcomb passed away. David had lost another real good friend. And the old recycling yard wasn't the same anymore for David. Most people would have given up then, but David kept on going. And with his health failing, he came across Harvest House at an old familiar spot in his route from years before, the old R.D. Holmes garage. David spent many days there at Harvest House with Wayne and Donna and his new family of friends. He enjoyed going to Harvest House, and by then his daily route that had started out years before at 15 stops a day was down to 4. They included Harvest House, Tim Hortons, Merle's Barber Shop, and the library. No Black Bear Tavern. David was walking with a cane by this time. He still got around and always went too fast. I always said David walked so fast trying to keep up with the world that's going too fast. He'd spend time at the library. Computers were right up his alley, and he'd spend hours on them. David was content at Harvest House with his new friends, but was struggling living alone at home. The decision was made to send David to Dykeland Lodge. I mentioned stubborn and didn't want to go. David didn't want to go. After much talking and having the Mounties involved, Dave gave in and went. My father's a resident at Dykeland, Bobby says, and I'm there on a regular basis. When David moved in, I knew he wouldn't stay. If you knew David well, there were 2 things he wouldn't like: being away from downtown Windsor and following orders. Remember, David did things his way, all his life. I drove David quite often last winter downtown. He'd wait for me in the lobby at Dykeland. I'd drop him off at Harvest House or Tim Horton. Donna and Blaine and Walter Forrest would drive him back. Later in the afternoon, David stayed the winter, but he wasn't content. He didn't like it there, and he told me several times when I asked him how he was getting on, "I want one day to visit my father and David." He was gone, just like me. Wait now, sorry. Just like that. David had moved to the Victoria Guest House on King Street, back closer to downtown Windsor. David was back in town, but he was getting tired. Too many moves and changes. He had a couple of bad falls and ended up in a wheelchair. The end was near for David. He was then moved to the Elms in Falmouth, across the river and out of town. He just gave up and died. That was enough for him in this world. On behalf of David, I would like to thank, and these are Bobby's words, Dykeland Lodge, Victoria Guest House, the Elms and their staffs for taking care of David during the time with you. The downtown of Windsor was David's home, and the people of Windsor were his friends. David touched many hearts in his own quiet way over the years. I want also to thank Lona's Funeral Home, Harvest House, Blaine and Donna, Father Tom, Pastor Bill, and you, the people of Windsor, for coming out on such a cold afternoon. I remember, I kind of know what David would say if he were here. It would be, huh? I do know one thing, his old buddy Brian Redden will be waiting for him up there with a bunch of radios. God bless you all. Thank you.